The Diocese of Brooklyn, New York. The story of the faith in this region began with the devotion of committed lay people who desired a parish home. It was nurtured and sustained over the years by charismatic bishops with a great concern for immigrants and the marginalized, and carries on today through the ministry of Bishop Nicholas DiMarzio.
Put out into the deep, people think it is my motto. Just listen to John Paul II, beginning of the new millennium, and put out into the deep. See at the end of your fingers, go a little further. You know, everybody's got to try a little harder.
This is the story of the bishops of America, the shepherds of the past and the shepherds of today, who through their callings and ministry carry the church into the future. It's also the story of their parish, their church, the cathedral. This is The Chair, an exploration of what it means to be an apostle in America.
In Brooklyn, you say, where are you from? The people would always say what parish they're from. Where are you from? I'm from St. Anthony's Parish up in Greenpoint. It's a place of neighborhoods. Each neighborhood really has a distinctive feeling. It's Greenpoint, it's Bushwick, it's Bay Ridge, it's Flatbush. And these were really built around the groups of immigrant people who came here and settled. And you go out to Queens, and it's a place where a lot of immigrants are coming to the parishes there to have readapted, reinvented themselves.
There's something like 80 to 100 million people who've either lived in Brooklyn or have a relative or ancestor who did, and that is a huge impact. You look at Hollywood, how many movies, TV shows involve Brooklyn. There is something about this place that has captured the imaginations of so many, and why is that? I think it has to do with the fact that Brooklyn has been a place of new beginnings. It's a place where so many people have come to start over. There's a sense of welcome here, an openness that's large enough to contain people from so many different walks of life. And this quality of Brooklyn has absolutely defined the Catholic Church here as well.
Catholics have their beginnings here in 1822 when St. James Church was built. And that was the first parish on all of Long Island, the first church constructed on Long Island proper. Up until then, Catholics, who were mostly Irish immigrants at the time, would have to take a ferry across the East River to Manhattan, and they would go to St. Peter's Church on Barclay Street.
When the Brooklyn Navy Yard opens in 1801, it opens up extraordinary job opportunities. Catholic immigrants, primarily Irish and German, but then other populations as well. They begin to settle in Manhattan, but then eventually with the Navy Yard, they realize they can start settling in Brooklyn.
There was a group of Irish men who were immigrants, including Peter Turner. Peter Turner was kind of recognized as the head of this group. And they signed a petition, and they sent it to the Archbishop over in New York, asking for a church of their own.
Turner has this lovely sentiment where he says, in the first place, we want our children instructed in the principles of holy religion. We want more convenience in hearing the word of God ourselves. In fact, we want a church, a pastor, a place of internment. As a result, Bishop Connolly agrees, and the first Catholic church on Long Island was built that same year.
By 1853, this small population of 70 Catholics has exploded to over 15,000. Now, Pope Pius IX creates the Diocese of Brooklyn, which at the time encompasses all of Long Island, and he appoints Bishop John Laughlin as Brooklyn's very first bishop. Laughlin serves the diocese for 38 years.
So Bishop Laughlin responded by a tremendous period of growth here in the church. I think it was close to 100 parishes that he established here in Brooklyn and Queens. Bishop Laughlin actually had plans drawn up for the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception, which was going to be on the corner of Lafayette and Vanderbilt Avenue. And he had to decide whether to put the money into building a new cathedral. He opted instead to build 2 orphanages for children here in Brooklyn. I think the fact that Bishop Laughlin decided to spend the money on orphanages is indicative of the care that our bishops have always had for the immigrant people.
The concentration of Catholics from all different parts of the world who landed in Brooklyn and Queens were really served by the many religious sisters. They were always on their side and realizing that they belonged to something far greater than their own ethnicity, that they belonged to the human race, they belonged to the church, which was universal.
1883, we see the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. It's probably one of the most iconic bridges in the world, sometimes referred to as the 8th wonder of the world. Brooklyn had already established a very pivotal role in American history, but what this bridge does, it connects the island of Manhattan to Long Island, allowing for traffic back and forth.
Well, Brooklyn's growth continues on in the early 20th century under its 3rd bishop, Bishop Malloy. Malloy becomes bishop in 1922, and like Laughlin, he's very young when he takes office. His tenure lasts 37 years, during which people have called the golden age of Brooklyn Catholicism. He builds more than 90 parishes and 100 schools.
Under Bishop Malloy, the Diocese of Brooklyn becomes the single largest diocese in the United States. It's been said that during his tenure, he was offered different positions around the country to serve as archbishop of different dioceses, and he absolutely refused to go because he just loved Brooklyn so much. He said, I want to go directly from Brooklyn to heaven.
You know, we like to think of the diocese also as a place where saints ministered. And one is Monsignor Bernard Quinn, who was really a patron of racial harmony. And he established the first parishes here in the Brooklyn Diocese for Black Catholics. He established a cultural center down there, St. Peter Claver. He built Little Flower Children's Services, a camp all the way out the island in Wading River, which is in Suffolk County, and it was an orphanage for Black children. And the Ku Klux Klan burned it down twice, and he rebuilt it. You know, he wouldn't stop. He was relentless, that he was going to give Black Catholics the same opportunities that whites had. And so he's really a patron saint for our times today when there's so much racial unrest.
The establishment of the Diocese of Rockville Center in 1957 was a pivotal moment for the Diocese of Brooklyn. By splitting off the suburban counties of Long Island, it reduced the size of the Diocese of Brooklyn to its 2 urban counties, Brooklyn and Queens. And that had the effect of recentering the diocese here on the urban core.
So in 1957, we had a new diocese, we had a new bishop. Bishop Magataga was coming in. He had been the president of Catholic University, so he was a very learned man. And I guess he was probably the right kind of guy to have here during the period of the Vatican Council. There was a lot of education going on here in the diocese.
Queens being a home from people from so many different parts of the world, it was very appropriate that in 1964 and 65, the World's Fair appeared in Flushing Meadows, Corona Park. This was the fair that was known for the famous Vatican Pavilion. Michelangelo's Pietà, which is in St. Peter's Basilica, was brought over for the fair. This is also the pavilion that was visited by Pope Paul VI during his trip to the United States in 1965. He briefly prayed in the chapel in the pavilion.
Bishop Francis McGovero becomes the first Italian-American bishop of Brooklyn in 1968. He had an extraordinary concern for the poor, the marginalized, and the outcast people of Brooklyn.
He was the only native-born bishop for the Brooklyn Diocese. I don't know anybody who ever said anything bad about the guy. He knew everybody's name. He was very personable, affable, and it was like a pleasure to be with him. And Bishop McGovero was a real people's person. When Bishop Daley came to the diocese, everybody was nervous. Everybody was nervous because we had lost Bishop McGovero, who everybody loved. And he was a native-born Brooklynite. And now, all of a sudden, Here's this guy from Boston coming in. It took a little while for him to get to know us and for us to get to know him. And once we did, I mean, Bishop Daly was one of the nicest guys you ever wanted to know.
In some ways, taking up the mantle of Bishop McGovero, Bishop Nicholas DiMarzio, the current Bishop of Brooklyn, is a fierce advocate for the migrant and immigrant communities, in Brooklyn in particular, but all around the world.
We had heard his name being mentioned, and he had a great reputation for working in immigration. And where else would you send a guy like that except to the Diocese of Immigrants?
The seat of apostolic authority for the bishops of Brooklyn is his cathedral. The Diocese of Brooklyn is unique in that it has two cathedral parishes, St. James Cathedral and St. Joseph Co-Cathedral.
St. James Cathedral is the first church in Brooklyn Diocese. It was made the cathedral in 1853, and then the current building was built in 1903. It's a neo-Georgian. It's a basilica style, so it has a rectangular shape, no side aisles, and an apse at the end. It is the historic cathedral of the diocese. It's also a basilica, and we can know that by the umbrellino. So this is this little umbrella that is red and gold that is always opened partially. So it marks it as a church that is for the Pope, and it waits for his arrival, partially open. It's in downtown Brooklyn, and it is small. It certainly was serving a much smaller community when it was built. Since that time, a huge Catholic population has grown up in the Diocese of Brooklyn, which includes Queens. So in 2013, St. Joseph's was elevated as the Co-Cathedral. So St. James keeps its status as cathedral, but St. Joseph's, which is a parish church, was elevated to also be the cathedral and really to be the center of activities for the diocesan events and liturgy. It's an Italianate building, so sort of neoclassical.
When Bishop DiMarzio came, he said he wanted to make this magnificent building the Co-Cathedral because he wanted a place where larger crowds could gather, and the changes there have been really magnificent.
The St. Joseph's is this house dedicated to Mary. And in the Diocese of Brooklyn, Mass is celebrated in between 35 and 40 languages. So how do we capture this diverse community? And the answer was to show apparitions of Mary, the patroness of the countries that are really well represented, both historically and currently within this most diverse diocese. On the side aisles, each bay becomes a little shrine to Mary, Our Lady of Knock, Guadalupe, Mount Carmel. Each individual mural says Ave Maria in Latin, which is the language of the Church Universal, as well as the salutation in the language specific to that apparition.
This church was not really that well decorated. It was very plain. I guess they didn't have that much money then. So I said, why don't we put them in the ceilings? And that's what we did. It's beautiful. It's not too ornate, and yet it's not plain. Every ethnic group has their own Madonna here.
As you enter the church, there is on the ceiling these medallions that hold symbols of the sacraments. So as you process up the aisle towards the altar, which is the source and summit of the Christian life, we also are processing with the milestones of the sacraments, beginning with baptism. The cathedra at St. Joseph's is the historic cathedra from St. James. It was moved to St. Joseph's, and then it was adjusted to really harmoniously fit within the architecture of St. Joseph's. A canopy was added, and then some little millwork adjustments to really make it feel a whole piece with everything else. The cathedra really marks the cathedral as the mother church of the diocese. So we look to that and come to that for direction, for consolation, and also for the authority of the teachings of the church. You know, our spiritual father locally sits there in the mother church.
Since 2003, the chair of apostolic authority in the Diocese of Brooklyn has belonged to Bishop Nicholas DiMarzio, the grandson of Italian immigrants and a native of Newark, New Jersey.
I grew up right across the street from Sacred Heart Cathedral. I have a brother who's 18 months younger than me and a sister who's 12 years younger than me. We had a school that was right in front of the cathedral. That's why I started school for the first 4 grades. We lived with my grandparents because my parents were married in 1943, right in the middle of the Second World War. My father's father came here when he was 14 by himself and made a life for himself, became a barber, made a living, had 2 sons. He'd come home from work at night, he put me on his knee, and he taught me Italian, word at a time. For every word I said properly, I got 1 penny, put it in a jar, put it on the windowsill. The next night I had a test. Did I remember the word? If not, took the penny back. He wanted to make sure that at least the first grandson spoke Italian. All my grandparents came from Italy. They were all immigrants, and my parents were born here. So I couldn't understand what to be an immigrant is about. There were difficult times in the 50s. The U.S. wasn't in great shape. It was tough. It was tough in that part of Newark, too. I worked in the summers in a dairy. You have to crawl into the hole and clean the inside of the stainless steel tanks. You can fall right into the brine. So it was a dirty job. It convinced me I shouldn't be doing this for the rest of my life.
As a young man, Nicholas DiMarzio took a trip to Lourdes, a pilgrimage that had a profound impact for the rest of his life.
We saw most of the cathedrals in France and then went to Lourdes, and that was a life-changing experience. In the baths especially, to see Europe at that time, to see Paris, Notre Dame.
The experience helped lead the young Nicholas DiMarzio to enter seminary, a decision he had been contemplating for many years.
So we lived right across the street from the church. You got to know the priests, seeing them every day, went to the school, was an altar server in the cathedral especially. I always wanted to be a priest when I was very young. I think in high school I wasn't that sure, but by the time I graduated high school, I went to the college seminary in Newark, St. Noel University.
Nicholas DiMarzio was ordained to the priesthood on May 30th, 1970.
It was a great event. I do remember it in Sacred Heart Cathedral. I mean, most of my sacraments were in Sacred Heart Cathedral from confirmation on. I was ordained a deacon there and then eventually a priest and even a bishop eventually. So it's a special place for me. I preached my own first Mass, so I said what I wanted to say to my relatives, to the parish where I lived my whole life, to the priests that inspired me. Most of them were there at that time, so it was a great event. First assignment was St. Nicholas Church in Jersey City.
Father DiMarzio's experience as a pastor and spiritual father to immigrants was excellent preparation for an assignment that would come years later. The Executive Director of Migration and Refugee Services for the U.S. Catholic Conference.
I was in Washington for 6 years. It was exciting, really, to learn the situation. The debate had already begun about legalizing the undocumented aliens, and so it became a learning experience, clearly, in getting to Congress, giving testimony before Congress and sometimes the Senate, whatever the situation was. So it really was a big learning experience.
Father DiMarzio earned his doctorate in social work to better serve the immigrant community. In 1987, Monsignor DiMarzio was asked to be the delegate working to free political prisoners in Cuba. On this trip, he had 2 face-to-face meetings with Fidel Castro.
One night at 11 o'clock, I got a knock on the door. Could you please get dressed? And we have to take you to see El Jefe. He never said Fidel, you said El Jefe. About 3 nights later, another knock on the door, went back again for another 3-hour harangue. Basically, he kept talking and talking. It was just me and him in a room. I understood most of what he was saying. I just kept reiterating, we want to help these people, we want to take them, it's not the government, it's the church. And he would tell me how good his place was. I remember one night he says, this country is so clean. I said, yo, that's wonderful, let's shake your head. And even one night he pulled the drawer open in his desk and showed me all the uncashed checks that he had got from the US government for payment of the rent of Guantanamo. They still pay rent, but he doesn't cash it because it's illegal, that they took it over. So it was an interesting time.
After finishing his tenure in Washington, Monsignor DiMarzio returned to the Archdiocese of Newark, where he became the Associate Director of Catholic Charities. In 1996, he was named an Auxiliary Bishop of Newark by John Paul II. 3 years later, he became the 6th Bishop of Camden, New Jersey. In October 2003, he was installed as the 7th Bishop of the Diocese of Brooklyn.
So I'm called the Nuncio. And the Nuncio, he's the one who asked me if I would accept being a bishop. And he said it in Italian first, saying the words of St. Francis de Sales, ask for nothing and refuse nothing. So he already gave the answer. He didn't want me to refuse. You get a call and say, the Holy Father wants you to go to Brooklyn, New York as bishop. I said, thank you. That's it. You say, aye, aye, sir. You don't argue the case, and you go.
In his years as the Shepherd of Brooklyn, Bishop DiMarzio has focused his energies on Catholic education, priestly vocations, and care for the vulnerable and marginalized.
One of the first acts that he did after he was installed as bishop was to speak at the Immigration Workers Freedom Ride rally at Flushing Meadows Park. Then later in that year, in November of 2003, he gathers with and spoke with the Brooklyn Muslim community as they were celebrating Ramadan. Shortly before he was installed, continuing this advocacy and this passion that he has for immigrant and migrant rights, he was invited to be a member of the Global Commission on International Migration, which was sponsored by the Secretary General of the United Nations. He was the only American citizen on that panel of 19.
He had an appearance of being a tough guy, with a hard shell around him. But if a priest came to him, he had a listening ear. This particular priest was going to Ireland, and he was taking his mother with him. The bishop reached into his pocket, he gave him $100, and he said, take your mother to lunch when you get to Ireland. 10 years ago, he had quadruple open heart surgery, and he was very sick at the time. But he prayed to Monsignor Quinn, whose cause is before the Holy See right now for sainthood, and he prayed to him, and he really credits Monsignor Quinn with his recovery.
During this whole time, I really was semi-conscious, but it's all I could think about is Bernie Quinn. Why? At that time, I'm near death. The doctor says, you didn't get here in an hour, you were going to be dead. So that whole time, I just felt thinking about him. And I think, that he was there, he was doing me a favor.
As we see Brooklyn being the borough of immigrants, we also see that the bishops who have led this borough are fiercely protective of and supportive of their rights and their ability to flourish and continue to celebrate their cultures and traditions as Catholics in Brooklyn.
I think I accomplished something that's certainly better now than when I came, administratively. Hopefully spiritually it is too. We try to balance the work between just administration and sanctification and teachings. A father to the younger people is the way I interpret it. A brother to your peers and a friend to the ones who are older than you. This is your job. You've got to preach the gospel. That's the job of the bishop. The way I think I could do that. Episcopal model is behold your mother, but put on the deep, I've kind of adopted in my columns now for the last 15 years. People think it is my motto. Just listen to John Paul II, beginning of the new millennium, put out into the deep. Go a little further, because we need that today.